Since the early chapters of Genesis, there has been a war raging between the offspring of the serpent and the offspring of the woman, between those who align themselves with the serpent in rebellion against God and those who will align themselves with and under God. Now, this isn't surprising because this is what God promised all the way back in Genesis 3 when he said there would be continual conflict between the offspring of the woman and the offspring of the serpent. But also in that text, God promised that one day he would raise up an offspring from the woman who would be able to win the war, who would be able to crush the serpent's head, take us back to the way things used to be. And ever since then, we've been on the hunt for that offspring. And the author of Genesis has taken us a long way down the road in knowing where we ought to look. Right? We started with Adam, and then we started to look through the line of Seth. And then from Seth, we went to Noah, through his son Shem, down to Abram, and then Isaac, and then Jacob. And then by the end of the book of Genesis, all the way down to Jacob's fourth son, Judah, the one from whom God would raise up a king, to whom all the peoples would bring their obedience. We know where to look by the end of the book of Genesis. But as we come into the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible, it's worth asking ourselves, what are some of the promises that God has made in Genesis that have not yet been fulfilled? Because it's these unfulfilled promises that create the tension in the story that ought to keep us moving forward as readers, that ought to stir within us a desire to keep turning the page. What are we actually looking for? What are we waiting for when we get to the book of Exodus? Some things that maybe are coming to your mind would be things like, well, that promise of that offspring. We're still waiting for that skull-crushing seed of the woman, right? But what else? I mean, think of the promises that God made to Abraham. That'll be helpful, right? And God promised to Abram that he would have innumerable offspring, right? Remember the descriptions like the dust of the earth, the sand of the sea, the stars in the sky. How many come down to Egypt? It tells you at the beginning of Exodus there are about 70. Well, I can count to 70, right? So apparently that promise has not yet been fulfilled. And along with that, they're not a great nation yet. They're not really a nation. In addition to that, God promised to Abram land, the land of Canaan. Where are they at the beginning of Exodus? They're no longer even in the land. They've never had possession of the land yet. And now they're not even in the land. They're down in the land of Egypt. Also, that they would be a blessing to all the peoples on earth. Well, maybe God did use Joseph to bring blessing to the peoples of the earth, but is that all that God wants to do? You see, some of the promises have maybe been fulfilled to some degree, and others we know have definitely not been fulfilled. And these things create the tension in the story so that we'll keep reading. Now we get into the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible. And we're introduced right away, or kind of a recap really, of the people from Jacob, of the sons of Jacob, the sons of Israel, who came down to Egypt with their families. And the text says that there were about 70 in all that made it down to Egypt to be reunited with Joseph and to be taken care of and preserved down in the land of Egypt. But verse 6 of Exodus chapter 1 says that then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. So it's time to move on in the story. But verse 7, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now we don't know how long this is taking, but we are seeing that God is beginning to do what he promised. He's giving many, many offspring to the children of Israel. And maybe we should even remember back in Genesis 15 that God did say something, didn't he, to Abram? That Abram's offspring would one day go down to a land that wasn't their own? That they would be sojourners there in that foreign land for a long time? That they would actually become slaves within that land? But then after about 400 years, God would bring them out with his strong hand, with a lot of possessions to bring them back to the land? Well, this is interesting because now the offspring of Abraham are in a foreign land and they are becoming a great people. I wonder what's going to happen down in that land. See, there's enough of them now for the people in Egypt to take notice. That, wow, if we just keep letting these people of Israel grow and grow and grow, one day they're going to get too powerful for us. And so the leader of Egypt has a plan to try to slow down the multiplication of the people of Israel in the land. And the first thing that he does in Exodus 1, beginning in verse 8, you find out that there's this king who does not know, or at least doesn't recognize or care about Joseph. He says, look, the people are getting too strong. Let's make the work really, really hard for them so that they won't be able to multiply. But verse 12 says, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. You see, the Egyptians are oppressing the people of God, but the people of God are growing anyway. And so they have to have a new strategy. The next strategy is even more terrible. This strategy is to go to the midwives, the ones who are delivering the Hebrew babies. And Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, says to the midwives, whenever you see a baby girl born to the Hebrews, you can let that girl live. But whenever you deliver a baby boy, kill the boy. And wow, we hear Genesis 3 in that, don't we? I mean, the attack on the offspring of the woman. I mean, here you literally have the Egyptians trying to murder the offspring of Israel. But what do the midwives do? They don't listen to the king. Well, Pharaoh calls him, and what are you doing? Why aren't you doing what I say? And the Hebrew midwives say, well, these women of the Hebrews aren't like our women. They're vigorous, and the babies just come flying out before we can even get there. Now, is that true, that the babies just come popping out fast for the Hebrew women? We're not exactly sure about this. I'm not sure if they're telling the truth or not, but I know that they fear God, and God rewards the Hebrew midwives for what they're doing, or for what they're not doing, for their refusal to take the lives of the Hebrew boys. And so the second plan of the Egyptians is also foiled. And so then it comes to the third attempt. The third plan is basically a decree from Pharaoh that if any Hebrew boys are born, take them and throw them into the Nile, into the river. Maybe even this would be something like offering them to the gods of the Nile. That brings us in to Exodus chapter 2. 3 attempts to destroy the offspring of Israel, especially the male offspring. What's going to happen? Exodus 2, verse 1, all the attention is now brought down to one family of the Israelites. A man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. And the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But then she realizes, I can't hide him for any longer. If they find him, they're going to kill him. They'll throw him into the Nile. And so what does she do? She builds a little basket, kind of seals it up so that she can put it in the Nile. She can put it in the river with her son in it. Interestingly, that word for basket in the text has only been used one time, or in one context before this. And do you know what it is? That the little basket that she crafts and then puts her baby boy in is the same word that's used for the word ark throughout the Noah and the ark story back in Genesis. And so here you have this little ark that she's putting her son in. And she's going to put him out there in the river. Now we may picture in our minds, like if you've ever seen like the Prince of Egypt movie, that this ark, this little basket is floating down, and there's all these like wild sea animals that want to destroy it and everything. I doubt it was like that. Maybe they even knew that there was a daughter of Pharaoh who couldn't have children. Maybe they knew that. Maybe they even knew where she bathed. Okay, we don't know, but what do they do? She puts the son in the basket, puts him out in the water. And what happens? The daughter of Pharaoh comes down to bathe, and here comes this basket with this baby boy in it over towards her, and she finds it and she sees it, and she has compassion on the boy. She names this boy Moses because she drew him out of the water. And she takes Moses to be like her own son. And you think about that. Here is the daughter of the man who wants to slaughter the sons of Israel. And God is using her to preserve this one boy that we've just been introduced to, a boy named Moses. And he's going to be raised in Pharaoh's house. Well, he is raised and he's educated in the house of Pharaoh. And then by Exodus 2, verse 11, that boy Moses has now grown up. And he goes out one day. He knows he is one of the Israelites, and he sees his fellow Israelites being oppressed. He sees their burdens, and he happens to see an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. This is in verse 11. And so verse 12 says, so he looked this way and he looked that way. And what does he do? He rises up and he kills the Egyptian, and he buries him in the sand so that he can deliver one of his fellow Hebrews. Well, the next day he goes out and he sees that there are two Hebrews who are in conflict with one another. And he wants to break them up and split them up. Well, one of them says in verse 14, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" And then Moses gets afraid because he realized that what he has done has been found out. That his killing of the Egyptian has been found out. He knows that Pharaoh's going to find it out and he's going to seek to kill him. So Moses has to flee from Pharaoh and stay outside of the land of Egypt. Now, we don't know everything that was going on in Moses' mind. It seems like he probably was trying to help his people, right? He was maybe even thinking, God has put me here in Pharaoh's house to be able to do something for my people. But as soon as he tries to help his people, they rise up against him, it seems, and they say, "Who put you over us? We don't want you in that position over us." And so he's forced to flee. Well, where does he run? He runs over to the land of Midian. And where does he go? He goes and he sits down by a well of water. And what would you expect a man to find at a well? Well, that's the best place to find a woman in the Bible. So he's down there by the well, and then we're introduced to this guy, a priest of Midian, who had 7 daughters. And the daughters come down to the well to draw water. And the shepherds come in and try to drive these girls away. And then who rises up? Moses. Gets rid of them so that the girls are able to water the flock. And they go home right away. They talk with their dad. And the dad's like, "Hey, how'd you get back so fast?" He says, "Well, there was this Egyptian guy down there. And he kind of rescued us from the hands of the shepherds so that we could get the water." And the dad is like, "Girls, what are you doing? You've left him. You find a man like that, bring him home." And so they go back. They bring him. And then Moses dwells with this man and marries one of his daughters named Zipporah. And he has a son. And look at what he calls his son. This is in chapter 2, verse 22. "She gave birth to a son, and Moses called his name Gershom, because he said, 'I have been a sojourner in a foreign land,'" which is very similar to that promise that God made to Abram all those years before, that your people will be sojourners in a foreign land. And here's Moses now not even in Egypt. He's been thrust out, forced to flee. He's out in the land of Midian, and he has a son named Gershom. It says, "I've been a sojourner in a foreign land." I wonder if things are moving towards the point when maybe God is going to act. Well, look at chapter 2, verse 23. "During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered what? His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel in their suffering, and God knew. I think the stage is set for God to act.